Are officially live. Sean, everything working? You still with us?
I am. I'm
Okay,
excited.
very cool. Me too. Here's the really cool thing, and I know that LinkedIn takes a few seconds to alert everyone that we're live and everything. So I'll wait to ask you the good questions for a minute. But just something that I like really love is that usually when I hit the go live button, this is like a little behind the scenes for everybody. I do get a little nervous. I feel a little like, butterflies and like, okay, we're going live, gear up for this. When I'm talking to you, Sean, I'm just like, okay, and we click the live button. It just feels like this one continuous conversation. And now everyone else is invited in, and that's great. But it was like we're already having the conversation, and now everyone else is just invited. So um
100%. Yeah, I love
yeah.
that.
Yeah. And I mean, I think that that is why I'm so excited to bring you on to talk about vulnerability and creating impact in your business, just because you you embody it so well. Like, just this is what our fourth conversation maybe, and yeah, if you are someone watching who does not enjoy a lot of small talk, you just want to make a genuine connection, reach out to Sean. Yeah, we like, just Sean, you're just so like deep and so real, and not pretentious about it at all. And you know how to do vulnerability right. Like, and it's just so authentic. And it's not something that's been like contrived, right? Or like, here's how to show vulnerability in your posts or in your, like, it really comes from such an authentic place. And I think that that's the best way to do it. And if we can learn from someone who, uh, is really gifted with that, then I think that's the best kind of person to learn from. So thank you for being here. And I also want to say that, you guys, Sean is in LinkedIn jail right now for an unknown reason. So he wasn't able to promote this on his LinkedIn page. So after the show today, go over to his page and follow Sean. He's always posting really great content. And we'll just be praying that your page gets back up sooner, that you can access it quickly. Um, but
Yeah,
yeah, thank
I
you.
just won't be able to I won't be able to respond until tomorrow at midnight. So
Oh, is that the your release date tomorrow at midnight when they're gonna let you back in?
yeah. Yeah, it was a 48-hour ban. So
Oh my
I'll be
gosh.
back.
Okay. Okay. Well, we're glad that at least, they're gonna let you back, and we know when that'll be. So yeah, if Sean takes a little while to respond, that's why. But don't let that stop you from heading over to his page. Okay. So why don't we do this? Let us dive in. Um, so the last time we talked, Sean, you told me that 2020 was like your worst year in business, like just your lowest revenue. I mean, you're a filmmaker, so some of those reasons are pretty obvious, with people canceling from COVID, I'm sure. But tell me, this is what I really want to learn. What does that mean? Like, what do you mean when you say that it was your worst year? And yeah, just let's just start there and see where this goes. I want to learn more about that and what that was like for you.
Yeah, great question. So I've been in filmmaking and video production space for about 10 years, and unofficially a little bit longer than that. And 2020 was actually looking to be the best year out of that entire journey. Um, at least in my world, I'm a solopreneur. A lot of my projects on my own through my own company are just through me. So I'm shooting, editing, directing, producing, and delivering. Um, I will work with other marketing companies and different nonprofits, and we'll have teams. But yeah, 2020 was shaping up to be about $150,000 year for me, and I had 70,000 in booked gigs, and so this is more the financial side of it.
Mhm.
Um, and at the end of March, I got back to back phone calls within a week, canceling or delaying every single one of those projects. And so everything booked out through kind of mid-July, maybe early August of 2020 was canceled. And it was the year where I had lined up the most gigs, like super excited, year was planned out, everything was kind of ready to go. And then financially just feeling very thankful and excited. And then it disappeared in like 7 or 10 days. And instead of doing 150,000, I don't remember the exact number. I think it ended up being around 25,000. Um, so just horrible, like brutal financial year.
Mhm.
But there's a lot of other layers to it. So I mean, I have a health condition for those that are jumping on and don't know who I am. I've had autoimmune diseases since I was 12 and, have had to push through those over the years and really work around them. I've ended up hospitalized for extended periods of time. And it's, it's, I've had a lot of clients that are very gracious and generous. And so it's almost an identity thing to work through getting new clients, explaining to them my illness, them still saying yes and still believing in me. And then it felt like an identity attack, so to speak, when COVID hit. And I just had all these no's back to back. I was like, oh shoot, I gotta go tell people my story again. And I have to practice vulnerability again. And I have to do this again because this is the only way for me to make money and to serve people is to be vulnerable with my story. Um, and
So
I have to be.
can I pause you right there and
Yeah.
ask you something about something that you just said? You had to be vulnerable again. So had you kind of built your company to the point where you had felt like, cool, I've got this thing going, it's growing. I can sort of write off of my success because people see the projects I've done and this thing is sort of running on its own. So like I don't have to, I'm sort of like beyond that phase of having to be vulnerable.
Yeah, that's a great question. Man, I guess I never thought about it that way, but I was in a place where the clients that I had knew me so well that I didn't have to explain it anymore. I didn't have to
Mhm.
get to this vulnerable place very often anymore. And so I kind of skirted vulnerability for a couple years and didn't have to I didn't my illness, would still affect things from time to time, but it wasn't a huge deal and the clients were like very gracious and everybody knew. And so I didn't have to explain it. I didn't have to put language to it. I didn't have to open up and be vulnerable. And so yeah, I think to a certain degree, I think you're spot on that there really was a period of comfortability is maybe the or coasting in my comfort of knowing that I don't have to be crazy vulnerable and attracting new clients and telling them who I am. And I had 5 or 6 really steady clients that I just would continually work with. And projects kept getting bigger, more work, and I didn't have to put myself out there as often. So I think there's like a positive and negative to that. I really appreciated how much more effort I could just put into the projects and the creativity and the work, and I didn't have to put myself out there as much. But I also lost the practice and lost the art of being vulnerable with my story. And it actually was way harder, I think, this time around in the last couple years to revisit that and to have to be vulnerable with my struggles and my imperfections yet again with new people in a new context in a new place. um I guess to kind of pick up from that part of the story, uh in 2022 my wife also graduated with her master's degree in occupational therapy, and we were super excited. She was looking for
Mhm.
jobs in the Midwest, um, and then COVID hit, and all of the job applications were rescinded or frozen, and they only were hiring essential healthcare workers.
Mhm.
So anybody that was, kind of respiratory or cardiovascular based, doctors, nurses, but OT wasn't top of the list at that time. And that put a, that definitely redirected our path, I guess is the simplest way to say it. She couldn't find any work in the Midwest. And there were just certain places that just didn't make sense for us to move to at that stage too. But we had looked at we had looked at North Carolina, we had looked at Portland, we had looked at Tennessee, we'd looked at all these places, like trying to find jobs and trying to find work. And the place where we felt directed to was Fort Worth, Texas.
Mm.
And so at a time where my business is getting, just hammered through COVID, my wife was looking for work too. And so we're both out of work for an extended period of time. And then we move and I have to reinvent my business. Um, and so like that
And this
mental
was in the middle of 2020 when you guys moved?
in the middle of 2020, yeah, towards the
Mhm.
end of July. So,
Okay.
there was about for me, it was an extended period of time. It was like a 9 to 12-month period of no work, no clients.
Mhm. Wow.
And for Megan, my wife, it was 6 months of no work. Um, so yeah, it was financially just incredibly stressful, and that I mean, it really grew us. It grew us in our marriage. It grew us in our partnership. It grew us in our surrender and in our faith. But from a business season in 10 plus years in my career ever. Um, and so much of it was realizing that, there were variables I could control. Like I could have been more vulnerable. I could have been reaching out to more clients. It could have been marketing differently. But there's also things that couldn't have been controlled, like the fact that almost every shoot everywhere in the world was shut down. Like you can't really
Mhm.
fight that. But there are, it really did humble me and teach me that there were practical things that I hadn't been doing well, or got comfortable in, and didn't want to share my story.
Hmm. So I like how you described it, that there was both the positive and the negative, that it's not always one or the other. Like we don't want to always be in struggle mode, in business where it's like, I've got to just get out there and keep hustling and keep hustling and keep getting that client one at a time. And, that can get kind of exhausting after a while. And I've never met a business owner who wants to be in that kind of stage in their business development for forever. Like we want to create the systems around your business so that you create momentum and freedom for yourself, right? And at the same time, there are just some extra things maybe that when you are putting everything you've got um into getting that next client, into really showing what you can do and proving your value and making those real connections, that there's a real art to that, and there's a real passion and focus involved in that. And so what I'm hearing is like you want to be able to retain those elements, but without sort of the I don't want to call it desperation, but in a sense, the reality is you're hustling at the beginning stages, right? So there's some really golden things that you want to retain, um, like the ability to be vulnerable in context, right? In the right ways at the right times. But not from a place of desperation, but you don't want to necessarily lose all the things that make you special as you grow.
100%. Yeah. And I've actually gotten, for really first time in my life, I have a personal trainer, and I'm taking it really seriously, and I'm like trying to put on weight and bulk up and get stronger. And I think there's all analogies in personal training that relate to business.
Mm.
Like the first couple sessions are really, really hard. Like they're just like your body is not set up in a place to do those workouts. It just isn't. And it builds that resistance over time. And you start to enjoy it. But the first 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 sessions, you're like, man, this sucks. Like this is hard. And my body hurts. I'm tired. Like I need to sleep more. This is a change. And that's I guess how I would describe like the hustle period in business, is that it's just like you're not in a rhythm. You don't have systems in place. You're not really operating out of a place of health. And it's a lonely, it's a difficult stage. And much like in the physical activity, like exercise world, if I'm not vulnerable with my coach, um and my trainer, the progress I'm going to see is limited to my vulnerability. Um, and I think the same is true for business. Like if we, and some of this is practical, some of it's emotional, some of it's spiritual, all these things. But the extent to which we're vulnerable is often the extent to which we're going to heal and we're going to grow. Um, and if we live in this space where we're afraid, or we put up a lot of masks and walls on our vulnerability and on our reality, it's unlikely that we're going to see progress, we're going to see growth, we're going to see healing.
Mm, that's really powerful, that the idea that the degree to which we're vulnerable is equal to how much we can heal and grow. I never thought about it like that, but there's definitely a strong relationship between the two. So how, like, I just want to point out, like, in storytelling, they say show, don't tell, right? That's a big thing in storytelling, show, don't tell. Like, don't talk about what happened, show what happened through details and examples and stuff, right? This is, I just want to point out to anyone watching that Sean is showing vulnerability right now through the way that he's sharing. Like, for example, I didn't ask him to disclose his financial numbers. That's vulnerability right there. Not a lot of people are willing to share financial numbers. And as a business coach with an emphasis on the finances, that, I can't just go ask people randomly to share with me their financial numbers. They'd be like, no, like, that's personal information. I'm not telling you anything, right? And there can be so much, well, we really risk judgment around sharing financial numbers as well. So just the fact that you offered that to really paint the picture of where you were at and where you were coming from, I really admire that. And because it really is like the level of information that you're willing to share, to kind of remove any ambiguity. It's just like, well, this is what it is, right? It's just the truth. And so, yeah, I just think that the way that you told your story was just showed that authentic vulnerability. And I think that, if you're watching and you're feeling this connection to Sean, like, that's why, because he's being real about his story. And he's offering these really powerful insights, and that he's not just making it up. So Sean, I'm really curious about this. Why didn't you quit? Like, why didn't you just look for other work? You were willing to stick it out and be unemployed for a season and just stick out a really hard time and re-engage with, you said you had to reinvent your business, and you moved to a new city. So, like, what made you decide to just restart and hit the ground running again?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's a few reasons. One of them, and I need to be careful with how I say this. We had we had family members that were diagnosed with significant medical issues, 6 weeks after we left from Milwaukee, Wisconsin, to move down to Fort Worth, Texas.
Oh my
And
goodness.
it's not my story to share, so I can't, that part I can't share
That's
vulnerably,
okay. That's part of
but
it, right? That's
yeah,
part of it.
yeah.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, that really affected Megan and I, and
Mhm.
our just we went through this grieving period. We went through this really tough questioning period of why did we move? Why did we move now? Should we move back? How do we support these people that are really ill? If someone passes, what do we do? How, like, just all of these questions. And so, like, that really put me in a funk for 6 to 9 months. So I was already in
Mhm.
this business um emergency state because of
Mhm.
COVID. And then I got put into a emotional depressive funk for another 6 months after that. And really wrestling with, where do I find worth? Is it in money? Is it in business? Is it in filmmaking and creativity? What about these people that we care about that are sick? Like, how do we, like, what are we willing to sacrifice for them? Is that our responsibility? And that period um, it just gave me a lot of space to think about what I value, the gifts that I have, how I serve people naturally. And so what ended up happening was just all of these conversations at coffee shops where I would sit with people, hear their story, help them pull things out and shape them and give them safety and space to share things about their lives. And that reminded me, and I guess reinvigorated me, that one of the greatest gifts that I've been given is helping people appreciate vulnerability and use it as a healthy tool, not something to be feared. And it just happens to be that I get to do that in filmmaking. And so your question of like why did I stick with it? Why did I come back to it? Um, I got to sit with a woman that following December, is like December, December 2020 or January 2021, somewhere in that time, learn about the story. And then in May of that year, I got to film with her. And she has had cancer 4 times, hours after I filmed her. Um,
Oh my
and she has one
gosh.
of the most powerful testimonies of faith, of courage, of perseverance, of sticking with it, of pushing through darkness and pushing through hardship and suffering, and still bringing positivity and joy and hope to people in the midst of her own intense pain. And I just sat there and absorbed her story and really listened, and I was like, man, that's like, I want to be that for myself and for other people. I don't want to be in this place of darkness and depression and suffering and hurt and feeling like the weight of the world is against me with COVID. Like I was in that place, and I realized through that, a series of months and like meeting with the family and then interviewing her, I was like, man, that is the story that I want for my life. Um, and I want to help other people tell that too. And I thought, like growing up, like I think like maybe the fun, like goofy side of it is like, man, I wanted to be a spy, I wanted to be a firefighter, I wanted to be a spaceman, like all the little, kid dreams that we have. Probably all of them at some point I had. And then as I got older, got into graphic design, thought that I wanted to be a designer. It just wasn't fulfilling. Like sitting in front of a computer for 10 hours designing graphics just wasn't my thing. And the gifts that kept coming up were like, Sean, you're a leader, you're vulnerable, like we love, having conversations with you, like you ask questions nobody else asks. I was like, oh, that's really interesting. Like I guess I didn't think that was that big of a deal. And so I started looking at counseling, I started looking at becoming a pastor, I started looking at teaching, and I think all of those are really valid, like they all are really possible options. But at the same time, I was also trained in ethical storytelling and filmmaking, and I just can't run away from it. There's something inside of me that I gravitate towards real stories, and I gravitate towards telling stories differently. I think so often, at least in the video film, YouTube, Hollywood space, like there's such a variety of content, and we can either be really entertainment focused or we can be really educational focused. Um, and there isn't there I just don't I see a big gap in actual real vulnerability done right, done ethically. There's something called trauma porn, which is kind of
Mm.
sounds a little scary. Um, and it's basically like, even like Times Magazine, National Geographic, like they have dipped into this place often. There's a famous photo of, I think it's a little girl, in one of the African countries, and she's laying on the ground. She's on her way to get food, and there's a vulture behind her, ready to eat her. She's that malnourished. She's incredibly skinny, and I don't know if it was seconds or minutes later, but she passed away. And the photographer just sat there, took the photo, and was paralyzed with what to do. And yet that photo ended up on Times Magazine or National Geographic or something like that. It's a really famous photo, and it makes you feel something. But the thing that's absent from that photo is agency of that little girl's story. Like she never gave permission for that photo to be used.
Yeah.
She didn't okay that photo. Like she wasn't involved in the storytelling process. Uh, and so often we do that in everywhere. We do that really everywhere, but I see it in nonprofits, I see it in businesses. Exploitation is a bit of a strong word, I think, in some cases, but we really are. We're taking somebody's story for our own gain and not inviting them in as a partner, not inviting them in, to recognize that what they're sharing with
Mhm.
us is a gift, and it's our job to shepherd their story. So yeah, I mean, a bit of a long-winded answer, but like the ethical storytelling piece, vulnerability, these interests in becoming a pastor, teacher, counselor, all of that pushed me back to filmmaking. And I just like that is, I have artistry in me. I have this desire to create in me, but I have this other, even more compelling underlying bedrock foundation that I just want people to be vulnerable. I just want real, truthful, anchored, lovely people that are wrestling with real life and the reality of pain and the reality of our existence and the gifts of time that we have on earth. So often we just glance by and take for granted what we get to do every single day, healthy or not, suffering or not. Where if we have breath in our lungs, we are still alive. If we have breath in our lungs, we can speak joy to somebody. If we have breath in our lungs, we can make an impact on the world. And it doesn't have to be big. But I had lost my breath in my lungs for a period, and I had to re-find it.
Wow. I would not call that long-winded. That was perfect. Wow. So I want to hear more about this idea of ethical vulnerability. I think, that story that you shared about that little girl, my gosh, it's like so heartbreaking. I think we can all think of something that we've seen or heard where we go, oh yeah, I get it. And you're bringing new awareness of the problems with that, right? Because you don't want to just use someone else's story, especially if they haven't given you permission. Um, you don't want to use it for your own gain. You really have to steward that and respect it. So, what does ethical vulnerability look like? Like, how I remember from a previous conversation, you said that a lot of the times vulnerability is done wrong. So, where do you see it going wrong? And then in contrast, what does vulnerability done right look like? And I think the way that you're just sharing of yourself is vulnerability done right. But what are some pointers or takeaways that our audience can use when they're thinking about incorporating, really being more intentional about vulnerability, not necessarily like as a, oh, here's a tactic that I can exploit, like, because that kind of is self-defeating, it sounds like. But how is vulnerability done wrong? Let's start there, and then we'll go to how to do it well.
Yeah, I think it actually starts at a basic level of definition that vulnerability, the Latin root for vulnerability is vulnere or vulnerare. I'm not sure quite how to pronounce it, but basically it translates to as to wound. And
Mhm.
vulnerability means that when you share something or when you put yourself in a particular position, you're in a place where you could be attacked and you could be wounded and potentially killed or destroyed. So it's a pretty hard word to work with, and I think we've diluted it or worked our way around it, and have lost what vulnerability actually is. Um, Authenticity and vulnerability sound very similar, but they're different. Like vulnerability is putting yourself in a place where you can actually be damaged for what you're sharing and
Mhm.
who you are. Um, so, in that sense, like to when organizations, I think this like organizations and social media especially have really diluted vulnerability and exploited vulnerability that isn't their own to exploit. And so ethical storytelling, the basis of it, there's a bunch of different tenets, but the core two tenets, uh, we often, you mentioned the word giving permission. That girl didn't give permission for the photo, and that's layer one. That's like baseline. That should always be expected. And permission can be verbal, it can be written, but that just should be expected, that somebody has permission for their content to be used.
Mhm.
And then the second layer to that is agency. And agency is saying like they have a certain amount of authority over how their story is shared. Um, I guess a good example of that would be like I've worked with sex trafficking survivors,
Mm.
and when they're sharing their struggles and when they're sharing their realities and the abuse and the trauma and the pain that they've suffered at the hands of others, um, they're they're sharing something very vulnerable to the point where pimps could take advantage of them again. If their location is compromised, they could be found again. If you're an incarcerated person and you're in, just getting out of prison, and you share something about your story, you could be reincarcerated. Risk to people who are in very vulnerable situations, and sharing that vulnerability, and not recognizing that, realizing that certain details may actually bring them harm, even though the story as a whole, or the context as a whole of what they're sharing may be really healing, it might be really helpful to people, but there's certain pieces that might be really damaging. um like that concept, where we're actually looking out as the creators, as the organization, as the nonprofit, as the business, where we're actually looking out for the best interest of that person, and we're giving them back agency over their story to say, no, I don't want that included, no, that's like that I need to protect that, that's a family member story, or whatever it is. I don't think we do that enough. I think that's been a big
Mm.
failure for organizations, a big failure for businesses. Um and then looking out for them, like that's cool that they have agency and they're telling us what they think needs to be removed or added into the story for safety, but we also should have their best interest in mind too.
Mm.
And of course I've failed at this, of course I've learned, over the years, and there's stories where I look back on and I'm like, man, I wish that would have been even more protective and more safe for the person involved. And I did a podcast with a good friend of mine, Brandon, and we were talking about how there's a tendency to lean into the creative, as a filmmaker. There's a
Mhm.
strong pull and magnetism, creativity, at the expense of somebody else, at the expense of time, of resources, of somebody's story, of somebody's reality. And part of the vulnerability and ethical storytelling practices is about reining that back in and saying like, no, the
Mhm.
creativity can take a back seat to protection and safety. um
That makes sense. It's kind of like it's easy to default into the end justifies the means kind of approach, or to make the safety and the welfare of the person whose story you're sharing like kind of an afterthought. Like, well, let's go back and edit what we can't use. When really it's more of the place you want to come from. You want to frame it as, okay, this is foundational. This is a priority that we need to be mindful of as we are creative in this process, as opposed to just like an afterthought. Would that be a fair way to characterize that?
100%, 100%, yeah. And there's a lot in the film space, we call it pre-production, but it's really like the research, planning,
Mhm.
preparation stage, where that the question of safety, of agency, of authority over your own story, like that should be projected back to the person, not
Mhm.
not absorbed in the entire creative team. Like we need to share in the creation of the person who's giving their story to us as a gift. um I think, like, to a second degree though of vulnerability, like online, we've seen a number of stories online, where more in the social media space, where somebody will post a photo of themselves crying, or I guess that was recently this week. um or they'll post things that sound vulnerable, but they're vulnerable, and it's like curated vulnerability for the
Mm.
sake of growth, for the sake of connection, and we have a natural tendency to do that as humans. Like, we really want connection, we want affirmation from people, we want people to say we love you, we care for you, we're proud of you, we like what you did, you're doing awesome stuff. Like, we desire that.
We need that,
And
right? Like, that's a
we
need.
need that. Yeah, we
Yeah.
need that. And it's not a bad desire, but we've used vulnerability as a way to manipulate getting that information from people.
Okay.
And
Yeah.
I think that's a dangerous form of vulnerability too, to dilute vulnerability. It's almost like crying wolf to a certain extent,
Mm.
that when somebody is truly actually vulnerable with something that's severe and potentially wounding and damaging, we've diluted it to this place where everything's vulnerable, everything
Yeah.
is scary, and everything's real, and everything's, possible to wound us, and that's just not true. Um, like, there's a number of things in my life that just, like, they might feel vulnerable to me, and then when I share them, I realize, like, yeah, that actually, like, that's really not that big of a deal. Like, there's really no threat, there's really no wound there, there's really nothing that can hurt me. That's probably not true vulnerability. It's uncomfortable,
Mm.
it's hard, it's emotionally, like, something vulnerable. Is it actually threatening to my existence, to my life, to my, to business, to what people are going to think about me? And I think more often than not, there's a number of instances where that's going to be not vulnerable and just comfortable. But the
Okay.
few that are actually vulnerable and actually threatening, we do need to listen to, we need to have empathy for.
Sure. So just because you feel uncomfortable, it doesn't mean that you're being vulnerable. So we should
100%.
be able to embrace what's uncomfortable, learn how to grow, like learn how to become strong and like, hey, this is maybe emotionally uncomfortable or it's new territory. And I need to be like, I need to push past it and be like, yeah, I'm gonna do it anyway, do it scared, and like that's great. And it's more of an internal risk, like in your own head, but there's not a real risk. We need to be honest about like what's a real risk versus just what's personally uncomfortable. So I love that distinction. So then how do you do it right then? Because I think we can identify, you know, when it's, oh gosh, like that person, comes across as fake. Like we don't want to come across as fake, especially for being genuine, right? Oh, well, let me ask you this. I want to backtrack because I want to ask you, is it possible to be too vulnerable?
Yeah, I mean, it's I think it's, it's a bit of a funny way to think about it, but like, there's a point at which you can be too unclothed in public, and you're gonna get arrested.
Hmm,
Like, there's a consequence for it.
fair
It's like a bit
point.
of a Yeah, it's like a bit of a goofy example, but like, yeah, there's a point where you can
Yeah.
show too much, you can share too much,
Mhm.
and there's a point where that needs to stop, um and it's for your own, it's for your own, yeah, I guess for your own benefit, to be thoughtful about how you're vulnerable, and to be thoughtful about who you're vulnerable with, when you're vulnerable, and how you're sharing it. The
Mm,
context is important, the people are important, the safety is important, the timing's important. I think vulnerability for vulnerability's sake, like, if you're just gonna streak through a football field, like, you're gonna get arrested. Like, that's just like that's gonna happen. Um,
You know the risk. You
and
know what's what's inevitable.
yeah, um, and to a much greater degree of severity, like, when we are vulnerable with wrong people, when we let the wrong people into the
Mhm.
gardens of our souls, and we have them start cultivating our gardens, like, they plant seeds, they plant roots. And when the wrong person is planting roots and seeds in the garden of your soul, they can do serious damage to you. And so,
Mm,
for somebody that's, for example, like, somebody that's in sex trafficking, um, they have to be incredibly careful and thoughtful not to be re-triggered themselves, not to linger in trauma, but to pursue hope and to pursue healing, but also not to trigger others. And so there's a personal side of vulnerability, but there's also a external thoughtfulness of vulnerability too. Like, if I'm
mm,
vulnerable with somebody that doesn't really that's not in a mental place to hear about illness, or that's uncomfortable with medical things, or is struggling with medical things of their own, and just in a really dark place, um, I have to be really thoughtful with how I approach sharing my story, because I think it first needs to come from a place of listening and understanding and empathy, and then if it's appropriate, if there are indications that that person actually wants to hear your story too, and like could be encouraged by your story, be vulnerable, like share your story, and it may backfire. Like there are times where I share my reality of medical suffering, and people have said like, no, 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 like I don't really want to hear that. Like that's not going to be our relationship. Um, it's very few, but those are places where vulnerability is not appreciated, it's not safe, it's not helpful. I was being proactive in a place where I should have been listening and empathetic, and so like there can be more simple versions of vulnerability that still put up walls, but the core foundation of being vulnerable is in your own walls to help somebody else take down their walls and to be
Mhm.
more connected. And connection is the greatest anchor for being vulnerable.
I think that's my
So in the
favorite definition of vulnerability I've ever heard. Taking down your own walls to help someone take down their walls so that you can be connected.
yeah,
Mm, that's really good. Because when you frame it that way, then the wisdom in how to apply vulnerability, whether it's to a social media post or a conversation you're having, or to public speaking, or to making a film, like whatever it is, if you frame it that way, then you can apply that wisdom. I think a lot, it brings clarity to like how to use wisdom in vulnerability, not to curate it in a fake way, not to exploit others, not to just share indiscriminately, but to use wisdom for that purpose of connection. And you're the one who's reaching out, taking the risk first. Like that's what makes it vulnerable, right? Like you're saying, I'm willing to take down my walls first.
100%. Yeah, and I think vulnerability, when you're only taking down your walls, it loses the community component of it. It becomes far
Mm,
more selfish. The healing is diminished, or the potential for
mhm,
healing is diminished. And then if you're sharing somebody else's story that's not your own, and it's a for you kind of mentality, um, the degree to which the story could be abused or hurt and damaged could, increases. And so yeah, I think that's a great summary of it. Like we need to be in a place where we're ready and we're willing, we're able to put down our walls down first, so that we can help somebody else take their walls down, and then find
mhm,
connection and forgiveness and love and all the things that we desire. But we don't want to make it artificial, and we don't want to make it
mhm.
self-focused completely, and we also don't want to abuse the other person's reality and story. Like they have agency over that.
Yeah, that makes total sense. And every time that you've talked about vulnerability done well, it's always been from the perspective of how can this help someone else, which I love so much. And I think when that's your heart, yeah, we're all going to make mistakes. Like, not everyone will appreciate it, right? The risk is real. If the risk weren't real, it wouldn't be vulnerability. But when your intention and your motive is pure, and when you're thinking about service to the other person that you're trying to make a connection with, or whatever that end goal is, or whatever that context is, you you're far less likely to go wrong when you're thinking about what's the right next thing to do in this relationship or in this context, or how I'm serving my audience, or how I'm telling this story. If you're thinking about it through that lens instead of what do I get out of it, then that's I'm pretty sure you're going to be on the right track then.
Yeah, yeah, and there's certainly times where we're gonna mess up. We're gonna lean more into the selfish side, or we're gonna lean more into sharing somebody else's story and realizing like, oh, that wasn't our story to share. We're gonna make mistakes. We're gonna mess up, and so it's I think the foundation of it though is exactly what you shared, that vulnerability really does come down to, like, are we taking both walls down, or are we just taking our walls down just to show people and to try to get affirmation because we're broken and hurting too, or we're looking for, confirmation that we're doing something great. Like that's a pretty hard and lonely version of vulnerability.
Mhm.
Um, I would argue like it is still vulnerability because you're still putting yourself in a place to be wounded, but you're
Mhm.
not doing it for the risk and reward of somebody else also finding healing too.
Mm. Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, that's a well, you guys, if you didn't have enough to think about today, you're welcome. So, I love it. So, okay, Sean, tell us what is a project that you have got going on right now that you're excited about that you want to share, promote. Tell us about something going on.
Yeah, I've had a few of them. So I just did a project with and this one already is already live, but it's just a short little promo video for a community center. And sometimes
Okay.
sometimes
You cut
this
out for just a second. You said it. Who was it with?
oh it's with Dave Kane. He's a creative producer in Milwaukee, and it's for Kinship Community Food Center. They rebranded and they I don't remember what they were called before, but they're a food shelter bank, and also educational resource on how to grow just really beautiful, fruits and vegetables, make your own garden, um, and trying to get away from processed food banks because that tends to be non-perishable foods tends to be the answer to food banks, and they're
Mhm.
trying to push that back and say like no, we really can grow healthy, safe, sustainable areas for fresh fruits and vegetables, and teach people how to do that and teach people how to shop for fresh fruits and vegetables. So it just was a quick promo video. It's actually probably one of the more simple projects I've worked on because it just was animating photos, but it meant the world to them. It was so fulfilling, and like they absolutely loved it. And there was a lot of thought into the ending animation graphic and how it connected pieces of their community together through this graphic. So sometimes the simple projects can be the most meaningful. So that was a really fun one. One I'm working on right now is with our local church in Fort Worth. It's a pretty involved project. There's three different videos. One is a documentary on what it means to be an ordinary person in the kingdom of heaven,
Mm.
and how we tend to elevate, particularly in the evangelical world, we tend to elevate pastors and elders
Mhm.
and charismatic leaders to a higher place than congregants.
Mm.
And we're really trying to say no, like we are all equals in the kingdom of heaven. It doesn't matter whether you're male or female, slave nor free, Gentile or Jew, like we are all participants in the kingdom of heaven. um, and so it's an ordinary person just interviewing a bunch of people from five different local churches in the area and reorienting our hearts around this idea that Jesus has come to save and redeem us all equally, not one more than the
Mm.
other.
Mhm.
Um, and all of our gifts are valuable. So like my gift of vulnerability is just as valuable as finances and business coaching or pastors and preaching and leading a sermon or what is like we are all equally able to participate in the kingdom. So
Mm.
that's in terms of most recent projects, that's probably the most fulfilling and like in progress
Oh,
one, but that one's really fun.
I love it. I love it. So, could you tell us a little bit about like your services if people want to get in touch with you, if they want to say like, "Oh, I think I need Sean." If you're thinking about doing a video, you need Sean. So, what have you got going on that you're currently, available for booking or just, services that you're offering now or in the future that you wanna promote?
Yeah. So I tell thoughtful, soul-provoking stories, and my website website's wilderstory.com. And the kind of the heart behind it, I guess, to take it back to a vulnerability place, is
Mhm.
we often get to we often in life get to experience really, really good things, and we get
Mhm.
to experience really, really hard things. And the wilderness tends to be this bridge between the two. When you go out into the wilderness, it's unknown, it's scary, it's dark, and you're alone typically, and you learn a lot through that. So for me, that was my illness period in the hospital. That
Mm.
was my wilderness period.
Yeah.
And the story that came out of that was, I'm a filmmaker. I'm made in the image of God. I'm a storyteller. I'm creative. I get to tell really deep, vulnerable, passionate stories. And that came from this wilderness place. And so I like
Wow.
to say that we all have our own, wilder stories.
Yeah.
Um, and we all have these places, whether you're in it right now or whether you're going to go into another one or you've come out of one. We're going to end up in the wilderness at some point, and what we do with that time shapes us going forward. And yeah, so in terms of like availability, I'm actually pretty booked through September, um but yeah, going into the fall, like I love working with nonprofits. I love working with medical, anybody that's really looking to tell really helpful, typically educational, documentary style video content for the organization. So a lot of it's very strategic on how to use the videos. But yeah,
Mhm.
it's part of my calling. It's part of my discipleship. It's part of how I serve
Mhm.
others. But it really came through this wilderness period in my life.
Did I spell that correctly?
Yeah. Oh, hey, there it is.
Yes. I just figured out how to put a caption on. Yay. Okay, so there's Sean's website. And what is the best way to get in touch with you? Is it to go on your website, connect with you on LinkedIn, send an email? How can people best get in touch with you?
Yeah, any or all of the above. Yeah, Wilder Story. There's a contact form there. My phone number should be on there, or LinkedIn. Yeah, shoot me a message on LinkedIn. Um, I just won't get to it until tomorrow night with my LinkedIn ban.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Sean, anything that you wanted to share, or is there a question in your mind that I should have asked and I didn't ask it, but it would have been a great question?
Oh man, that's a great question. I actually think like one of my favorite questions to ask is, I'll give you a couple of them. So where are
Oh,
you
yay.
finding the most yeah where are you finding the most purpose and fulfillment in life?
Mm,
And that's a really deep question. Another one is faith important to you? And it gives people the option to say yes or no. Sometimes I'll ask like, what does faith look like for you? That's another way to phrase it.
mhm,
Um, and then the other one is, what is best and worst about blank? What's the what's the best and worst part of running a business? What's the best and worst part of being a mom? Or what's the best and worst part of running a marathon? Like, it gives people space and permission to say the really positive thing and the really negative thing. And
mhm,
I think in conversation we often gravitate towards one or the other. Like, some people are very positive oriented and they only like answering the positive, and some people are very negative oriented and like,
mhm.
oh man, life's hard. Like, I don't know. Like, I'm really struggling with this, and it gives people space to answer both. Um,
I love that. I love
so in
that.
terms of yeah, so in terms of like purpose and fulfillment for me,
Yeah.
like I'm finding a lot of purpose really through LinkedIn and just through connections on LinkedIn, and how much that's challenged me to understand my values, to understand my worth, to understand how I help others, to understand why I enjoy helping others, to try to change it from being a selfless output to being a selfless uh, connection to people,
Mm,
and a selfless help, and um, empathetic platform that I can use to bring thought to others that maybe they haven't thought about. Um,
mm.
so that's yeah, I've been really enjoying that. I'm exercising a lot this summer, so I'm really enjoying like bike riding, running, and just finding purpose in being outside. Like, I hadn't picked up a camera now it's, now it's been more recent, but for about it, that 9 to 12 month period where I just was in the funk for a while, I didn't pick up a camera that entire time. I sort of fasted from using my camera, and then it just turned into like apathy
Mm.
towards creativity and photography and video. And so the summer I've gone out and just started filming things, and I just missed the activity of life and being around people. So I'm finding a lot of purpose in that. Um, I would say the best and worst part about business, like the best part of business is the depth and the thoughtfulness and the intentionality behind projects. I've actually I really enjoy the creativity and like the filming side of it, but sometimes that's not the the most fulfilling part of it for me. It's the depth, it's the vulnerability, it's the story, it's
Mhm.
sitting with somebody. And I like to say that I'm gonna do this and I'm gonna be me, regardless of whether there's cameras there, regardless of whether there's a film to be made or not. So some of that's just going to coffee shops and meeting new people. Some of it's going to church and meeting new people, and a lot of fulfillment in that. But the worst part of business right now is realizing that my systems don't support growth in the way that I
Mm.
thought they would.
Mm.
Have
Gotcha.
been a lot weaker. Yeah, like my operations have been a lot weaker than I wanted to admit. Um, so I'm learning to I business coaches, and I'm really learning to put in new operations and packaging and pricing and all those
Mhm.
things, and really level up the business side of it. Yeah, so that's, I mean, it's been really, I would
Good.
say it was like it was the worst part of it, and now it's starting to get better. But like that definitely was a challenge for me to learn how to scale, to automate things, email campaigns, all that kind of stuff. Like
Yeah.
that just wasn't, it wasn't my wheelhouse.
Yeah. No, that's fair. That's really I see that all the time because you've got this skill and you're like, I'm out on my own running this business, but there's kind of two elements of it. You can be really, really amazing at your craft and what you do. And as a result, you generate plenty of business, but then it's like, what do I do with this? How do it's like bigger than what you can handle almost. And it's no longer how do I just get the next client? It's how do I organize this? How do I systematize this? How do I make more money without just getting busier and busier? And so then you realize like, oh, there are other hats that I'm wearing and how do I do this? So you're in a great spot if you're being proactive about all of that. And that'll create more freedom for more creativity and doing the things that you love to do and making a bigger impact. So that's great to hear. Great to hear, Sean. Thank you so much. This has been so valuable. And I think that we've all learned so much about vulnerability, how not to do it, how to approach it the right way, and just really well in service to others. And then, yeah, especially those questions at the end were great as well. I think we can all incorporate those, and those are powerful questions. And it's been really fun to get to know you and hear more about your story. So thank you so much for joining me today.
Absolutely. Yeah, this was a blast. This was awesome. I wanted to
Awesome.
ask you,
Yeah.
where
Uh-huh.
where where are you finding the most purpose and fulfillment in life?
The storyteller has to turn back on the interviewer now. The most purpose and fulfillment in life, I'm finding that in, I think, creating balance, even though I think balance is a myth, but being able to build a business where I can still be at home with my family, like where I'm creating the flexibility and freedom to make an impact in the ways that I feel God is calling me to in business, but then not in a way that compromises my family either. And so really learning how to do that well, I'm finding a lot of purpose in that, like in disciple. What does it mean to disciple my children? What does it mean to be present in my community? Like physically where I am, like all of those things. I love having the time and space and freedom for that. And I love this part of my life where I get to meet people all around the world and make an impact, in their businesses. So I think it's finding that stride of living in that both and. Um, And it's a constant iterative process of figuring out what does that actually look like in every season of life. But I'm really enjoying that.
What do you feel like is most misunderstood about running a business?
Ooh, really good question. And I'll answer it and then I got to go because we're doing this in real time and I'm going to be meeting with a client in 1 minute here. But uh, the most misunderstood thing about running a business, my gosh, I feel like there's a few. I would say for the Christian entrepreneur, it is how does what I'm doing in business fit in the kingdom of God? I think it's a lot of us have felt very ostracized, alienated, kind of like what you're doing doesn't really, it's sort of like separate, kind of like what you were saying about how we've tended to elevate pastors and just people in certain positions with certain titles in the church. But even more when it comes to, yeah, but I run a business that's secular, right? Like it's not necessarily a Christian ministry or something like that, or maybe I need to have a nonprofit to justify my business's existence or whatever. And I'm saying, no, like the business is the context in which you are doing the things that God has called you to do. So I think that would be my number one, like, because that's so foundational. And once you get that right, then you can start walking in freedom in your business.
Hmm. Well, I'll
So
refrain from asking more questions because you've got a meeting now, but we'll flip the
I've got to
table
get
someday too.
going. Well, we're going to continue the conversation, Sean. We're
Yeah.
not done talking. So thanks you guys for joining us today, and I'll see you next time. Thanks so much, Sean. Bye-bye.
Thanks everybody. Bye.